back to recording, we're back to the meeting. Welcome everyone back, thank you. I'm just gonna go back to the chat for a quick moment. The chat is not part of the official public record. So I did still just want to acknowledge that Alex had comments in support of on-the-job training, what they can and can't do. The comments.
Yes, thank you for that. I have a lot going on in the office here, so I just put it in the chat, but I will keep that in mind normally going forward.
No problem. I had mentioned it as part of our protocols, so that is that's on. Okay. So just for our recap and proceeding with the discussion. So it sounds like we can consider, as we move forward, we can consider police, corrections, parole, and probation towards any of the private security professional certifications. And when we get into what the training and the minimum standards are that you have to have as part of that experience, we may be able to define more one or another. And I'll add into that the reserve officers. There's a small consideration for the possibility of telecommunicators and emergency medical dispatchers towards the alarm monitor professional certification, but not towards the unarmed and armed. So keeping in mind the general focus that you all were mentioning, that kind of that public interaction and what was also termed as field work. I want to touch on regulatory specialists who work for the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission. DPSST does training and certification for those individuals as well. It is a small group of folks. It's not a very large certification, but just in considering it, whether we continue to consider it moving forward or we go ahead and mark it off the list now, I think in general we could probably give an overview that they are doing inspections, investigation, and compliance work with across the state through OLCC licensed businesses.
And not armed.
And they are not armed individuals. So just wanted to open it up for discussion.
Michael
McNerney, I would advocate for those folks to be able to essentially challenge the unarmed class or take the refresher rather than the full course. But I think for the armed, they're going to receive some instruction on firearms protocols that they desperately will need, having not used them in a professional capacity.
And I think that's probably something very key to put a marker down for when we're deciding what skills have to be demonstrated. Is any prior law enforcement experience we accept, we'll have to evaluate that component of firearms training and certification, separating out when they can apply for unarmed and when they can apply for armed, based on how long ago they took their firearms training and certifications and things like that. You know, recognizing that corrections officers have some level of firearms training and certification, but they don't necessarily carry that with them all of the time. Some parole probation officers do and don't. So being able to demonstrate that they have a timely firearms training component in order to be able to take abbreviated armed training will definitely be a conversation. Have a hand up for Mike Brandt.
Yeah, I think that timely certification is easy. It would need to be within the last year. If it wasn't within the last year that they took their firearms training, then by our standard armed security they would have to be recerted anyway. So I would say if it's longer than a year, then they have to go through the course.
Good marker. I will put that in for our conversation. Tom,
Yeah, I think OLCC should have to take all the training. They shouldn't be exempt from this. Just the inspectors that I've worked with, they don't deal with security a lot. They just deal with basically enforcement of the rules for the OLCC side.
Stephen?
I would agree with Tom on that as far as the OLCC inspectors. And also with regards to the firearm training, I would say definitely if it's been within a year, then yeah, otherwise they need to take they need to redo the course.
Can we clarify what we mean by the course? Are we talking the
refresher.
24-hour course or the refresher?
The refresher.
and I definitely want to put a marker in that for our future discussions when we're talking about what amount of training and what amount of demonstration we have to do. I'm going to focus on whether or not we would like to consider them as part of the law enforcement family for experience. We can delineate the length of time for firearms training and demonstration later. Yeah. So I think so far we've had one that says maybe unarmed and two have said, no, not really, take the full basic course that you would need in order to obtain your unarmed certification and then therefore your armed certification.
Mike McNerney, not that it matters, but I'll defer to folks who have worked with them previously. So if the consensus is appearing to be, let's not exempt them, then by all means, let's have them take the full course.
Is
Mike
there?
Brandt.
Sorry, go ahead.
I have also worked with LCC, and I totally agree. They really need to go through the entire course, both armed and unarmed.
Okay. Eric, did you have follow-up?
I did, but I will defer to those who have trained them before because I have not. So thanks for speaking up, guys.
So generally hearing that the OLCC regulatory specialist isn't that law enforcement experience category. We would not be considering that area.
I agree.
Correct.
Larry wants to.
Okay, so consensus. All right. What about military law enforcement specialties? So, for example, when someone has been a military police officer, does that qualify for the first level of eligibility and consideration? Give us your training, give us your information. We'll determine if it's within the right amount of time, the right amount of training and that type of thing.
Mike McNerney, I would say yes to MPs. I would not say generalized military experience should provide the same level of exemption.
Mike Brandt, I agree.
Alex Gallagher also agreeing on that one.
Eric Knopp, I would agree with that as well.
Yeah.
I agree. As do I.
I would agree. Military police or master at arms mate would be sufficient, but not for just regular military.
All right, thank you.
But we also need to make a time limit. 4 years. 4 years.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So we also had some earlier discussions touching on training and experience and certification that comes from out of state for these categories. And there was, the first comment was we don't accept out of state towards private security out of state towards private security in state. And then what are the considerations and processes of accepting law enforcement experience from out of state for law enforcement experience in Oregon. So I just wanted to reopen discussion on out of state prior law enforcement experience.
Eric Knopp, I think if they were sworn and out of state, that should provide consideration. If they weren't, then that's a different issue.
Mike, Fran?
I agree with that, with Eric. However, I do think the one kind of a blanket rule that we can put forth is when we start talking about law enforcement or military or anything, it all has to be within a year. If it's longer than a year, then it's not within our parameters for private security certifications, especially for armed. And so then I think that they go through the whole course if it's been longer than that.
Yes.
Okay.
Can I just say maybe one of the things we might consider is if their previous law enforcement experience or certification, it should meet at least the minimum requirements that Oregon has for our law enforcement requirements. If we're going to take that into consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Eric
Yes.
Knopp.
I'm sorry,
I-
Eric.
No, that's okay. I think a year is a little restrictive. If we allow someone to take the unarmed course and let their certification lapse and allow them to take the 4-hour refresher course within a period of 4 years, I don't think I can see a good correlation between that and saying, well, unless you were a cop within the last 365 days, that your experience doesn't count anymore. That seems like a cognitive dissonance there to me.
I thought it was 2 years.
And
2 years.
and we will.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to dive into that as we continue forward. So, in general, for consideration, we'll continue to consider right now accepting out-of-state law enforcement, and then we'll, as we move forward in these discussion topics, identifying how much experience and how long ago it took place. So I have that we're already police officers, corrections officers, parole and probation officers, reserve officers, military law enforcement, like a military police officer, master at arms, and some consideration for law enforcement out-of-state training if it has been found comparable to what we require here in the state of Oregon. We are not carrying forward the OLCC regulatory specialist, and we may or may not consider telecommunicators and emergency medical dispatchers towards alarm monitors once we get into that discussion of training requirements and things like that. Is that pretty much a good recap?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So let's take some time to look at question number 2. And question number 2 starts to 2 and 3 are the beginnings of some of the things that you've already been talking about. So what is the minimum amounts of experience the applicant needs to show us for it to be that eligible for prior law enforcement experience, and how recent does that experience need to be? So when we're looking at what is the experience component, are we looking for training, employment, and certification, or some combination thereof? Keeping in mind that reserve officers don't have a DPSST certification, but they do have training that they've taken through their employment agencies. We found an example from North Carolina that says any person who has successfully completed the North Carolina Basic Law Enforcement Training and the first year of probationary employment. So they were setting the minimum training and at least 1 year of working in that position. In a past process, so way back, 1997 to 2012, there was a unarmed and alarm monitor challenge process whereby a person who had 2 or more years of experience in law enforcement, and that's all it was qualified, 2 or more years of experience. So things to think about when we're talking about the length of time from when a person has had their experience to when they're applying for private security. Again, an example from North Carolina, they were requiring within the 3 years preceding the date of application for private security. Washington says the most recently employed full-time sworn police officer not more than 5 years before applying for private security. Here within Oregon and DPSST, if a police officer, corrections officer, or parole probation officer is no longer employed as such, their certification will lapse after 90 days. Once they are separated for 2.5 years, they have to complete refresher training for DPSST in order to reactivate that lapsed certification. And then if they've been out of that profession employment for 5 years, their certification is completely expired and they have to complete all of their basic training from the beginning. So those are some of the timelines that apply to the law enforcement certifications in Oregon. Private security professionals are required to complete full basic training if they haven't held certification in over 4 years. So it's a 2-year certification, and if that certification expires and it's been expired for 4 years, when you reapply, you'd have to take the full basic private security training in order to be eligible for certification. And then, as you all have mentioned before, we have the firearms annual refresher training components for armed private security professionals. So that is part of a knowledge and skills demonstration that happens annually for the armed private security professionals. So as you're going through this, you may be able to even identify what's eligible for unarmed, what's eligible for armed, what's eligible for alarm monitor, what's eligible for event and entertainment, if those things apply. So opening the floor for discussions on what's the minimum amount of experience and how recent does it need to be. So in the order that hands are up, Mike Brandt.
I would agree with Eric on the 4-year for unarmed for law enforcement. My caution with the armed is, Eric, as you know, we qualify it every quarter with law enforcement. We only qualify once a year for private security. Firearms, it's a diminishing skill. So beyond a year, there becomes an accuracy issue that I think we need to be careful that we don't abbreviate that side.
Sure, I would agree with that. I don't think there's a question as to whether or not they'll have to shoot the qual as part of the refresher training. I think the question is how much time is allowed to lapse from them not serving in law enforcement capacity to being allowed to take the refresher course instead of the full course. And I think that that legal knowledge is, depending on, I guess, how long you were in law enforcement, is going to still be there. And I think a refresher course is still enough, and then they still have to demonstrate the firearms competency portion of it either way.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that.
Michael?
Yeah, sorry. Kind of the same. I think if we mirror those certification requirements, right? So if we're going to say you've taken this unarmed training before, but after 4 years it's considered to be void, we use that same stricture just to make sure that we don't have somebody who, went through law enforcement or post training so long ago that, people were doing carotid holds and things like that, and have relatively fresh experience, and it's in line with our current standards. Keeps everything nice and consistent.
Okay, so are we looking at, they have to be certified in the state that they worked in? So in Oregon, you'd have to be certified, which means you've completed your basic training course. Is there a minimum amount of employment time the individual needs to have?
I love, sorry, Mike McNerney, I like 2 years because a lot of departments hire you and you don't get through the academy until the end of your first year. So I think 2 years is pretty reasonable.
I agree. Mike Brandt, sorry. Once you've passed the academy, you have to go through field training. And so I think that helps kind of eliminate the people that didn't pass their FTO.
Stephen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was going with Mike Brandt is that, 2 years I think is good for experience.
Tom?
I think we try to keep it as simple as we can. Let's keep it 4 years, and if they've had the 2 years law enforcement experience, then they have to requalify and do all that and make a refresher for that part of it. But anything after 4, you have to take everything all over.
So, anyone else,
That's what we
2 years of experience? So you've been trained, so you've gotten your certification, and you've been employed doing the work for 2 years. Does anyone else have a perspective on that amount of minimum experience?
This is Krista. I like 2 years. I'm just curious if we are blanket applying the 2 years regardless of the fields that we've selected.
Thank you. I think that's a good question. In general, I would probably say from the perspective of the certified disciplines, that works. The reserve officer is a part-time position. So it's not going to be the same 2 years. So you all may want to further the discussion.
Sorry, Mike McNerney. I think the idea there with the 2 years is not necessarily that we're looking for the person to have been working in the position, fully trained and up and running for 2 years, as much as we're trying to capture the training ramp up period and some actual like doing the job successfully with 2 years. Yep. And I think that
exactly
gives us a window that will work for anyone who, like, if it's an accredited agency and they're a reservist, they're taking 300-hour academy, that covers that same window of time.
Yeah, Mike Brandt, even as a reservist, you're still required with most agencies to put in at least a minimal amount of hours every month to stay qualified, as well as doing all other training. So I think that you are showing quite a bit of experience in the field, even as a reserve.
Absolutely. And I look at a reserve police officer much the same way as I viewed my own service as a volunteer firefighter. We go through a lot of the same training as a volunteer firefighter that we would as a paid firefighter. The difference is that we don't stay at the station. We're not full-time paid employees of the fire department. We're volunteers. Reserve officers are part-time, but they still have to go through the same training that, from what I'm understanding, that they have to go through the same training that a sworn officer does through DPSST. They just go through an accredited program that's offered by their department.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I didn't know if you had a more specific one or another
No, I just wanted to make sure that it was
across all of them.
across all of them and that it had, that was a part of the consideration that everybody was making.
Okay. That's great. Any other? It sounds like everyone has consensus that the minimum amount of experience is 2 years. Okay. So now we're talking about how long ago you left that position. We've been talking about 4 years broadly. If you've been out of law enforcement for more than 4 years, we've also talked about the component of being able to have recent firearms skills demonstration and tying that to 1 year. So what other conversations and things do we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about that timeline? How long has it been since you were employed as a law enforcement officer?
Did you say that the basic police cert lapses under DPSST rules after 5 years?
It's completely expired at 5 years, and you have to recomplete all training for across all of the certifications. So at the 2.5 year mark, you have to come back and take refresher training.
Yeah, I'd be interested in a discussion on a 5 year cutoff to keep that similarity in line.
Mike Brandt, isn't it private security though? Our cutoff is 4 years, correct?
Yeah, 4 years is what I'm reading here.
Right. So that I think that's why we originally were talking about 4 years, is because it just kind of kept all of our stuff consistent in the private security.
Sure, but we're not talking about a lapse in security certification so much as like we're having a conversation about whether or not prior experience qualifies. And I'm trying to evaluate like a retired officer who, gets bored sitting on the beach and decides he wants to work security part-time, and it's been 5 years. Has he really lost an entire career's worth of knowledge? And at some point, I think it becomes kind of an arbitrary discussion, right? Like we have to draw a line in the sand somewhere. So like this isn't a hill that I'm going to die on. I was just thinking that if DPSST says, hey, after 5 years, you need to recertify as a basic police officer, then I think allowing up to 5 years from your separation to be able to take the refresher would make sense to me. And then obviously, like that 4 years only applies to unarmed, because if your armed expires after, like when that expires, you have 90 days, and then you have to take the 3-day course all over again.
Well, I mean, I was an unarmed security officer for over 20 years, and when my license expired at 4 years, I had to recertify all over again. And I mean, I was 20 plus years so yeah, I think 4 years is sufficient. I think it's a good number.
Michael?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm open to the 5 year, but I do think there's a lot of value in the consistency within the unarmed program, so that we're not, wait, is this the 4 year, is this the 5 year? Which one are we talking about at any given time?
Any other thoughts or timelines on the general for unarmed?
Mike Brandt?
The only other thing I'd add to that is I agree, Eric, that 5 years is their certification, but at 2.5, they have to go back for a refresher. So it's still kind of saying at 2.5 years, yeah, you've probably lost enough that you need to have a refresher. And so by 5 years, I think you've lost enough that you probably should just have a total refresher. So I like the 4 years.
Yeah, logically that makes sense to me.
That still covers the 4 years.
Well, yeah, he was just reiterating.
So consensus seems to be that the 4 years is appropriate. So the clarifying question, or just to ask the question, when are we starting the clock? So if we're saying, when you apply for private security certification and it's time to take your private security training and you go back 4 years, do we need to do anything? Is it from your last day of employment? What if there are extenuating circumstances where a person was on leave before they left their employment? You were saying military deployments.
Yeah, this is Marie Atwood for the record. I was just thinking we should be really specific about when that 4-year clock starts ticking, because there may be a person who, basically leaves their job at a police agency due to life circumstances, right? Maybe an illness or an injury, they go on extended admin leave. Let's say they're on FMLA and working paid leave for a year, right? They're still employed, but they're not in the field. So does that last year of their employment count toward this concept of experience we're discussing? When does the clock begin?
Jason?
Yeah, with the whole thing, I believe it should be one number all the way across, like 4 years, no matter who you are. And if we give them a general equivalency test to see what their skill range is, to determine, do you have to take the full course or the 4-year refresher, let their knowledge speak for them, and as long as the years haven't lapsed and they're competent with the small skills test, it shows what they have or have not forgotten, that should be sufficient, I believe.
Steven?
I think maybe have the 4-year clock start at the expiration of their last certification.
Would that be the 90 days? Yeah.
Stephen answered what I was going to say. Let's just make it at the end of their last certification, 4 years from that.
So I'm gonna throw a wrench in the works for a second, like in the outer state with what Oregon does. So in Oregon, 90 days after you're separated, it lapses. And so we're talking about starting the 4 years after that, after the certification goes to lapse. But I don't know what's across the board nationwide. So if we have an applicant from out of state, I don't know how that would line up, as opposed to just whatever the last day of employment was.
And Susie Marine, for the record, maybe that's part of the evaluation process. If those out-of-state ones are going to have to submit everything individually for us to review.
Okay.
That we just look at what the standard is in Oregon, the 4 years and plus the 90 days, and then look at that when we reevaluate everything.
Okay.
Mike McNerney, I'm a little concerned that we're talking about 90 days after separation. That doesn't necessarily account for those outliers we were talking about where somebody isn't separated immediately upon end of working shifts. So we still need to have some acknowledgement that, I mean, if you do it right, you can be on FMLA and OFMLA for a year, 18 months, sometimes up to 24 months. Like, there are ways to really be out of commission reasonably for a decent amount of time. And there are also reasons somebody might be on administrative leave for a significant period of time during an investigation. And so I think, we really do want to, if there is a reasonable way to do it, to peg it to sort of the final working day, the final, the last day that they were actually scheduled to performed services.
And before we get to Mike, Michael, we'll get to the conversation related to those that are currently under investigation. And that will play another role in the evaluation process, but absolutely correct on that, to consider that.
Krista was next.
This is Krista, and I was just gonna throw out the word active employment, versus like when I think of the word active employment, it doesn't mean on leave, it doesn't mean, probation or anything like that. So just for consideration, I think I would like 90 days from your last day of active employment.
And Jen, is that defined in the CJOAR's active? Because we
Uh,
could potentially define something like that.
Yes, we can include active employment in this prior law enforcement experience standard. It's not, I don't think there's a definition for it in the criminal justice rules, because you're employed and your certification is good and then it lapses.
Right.
So that's an interpretation of active, but in this sentence, we're saying that active means that you have been performing the duties of. So what was the last day that you were performing the duties of?
Right.
And that is when, or potentially 90 days thereafter, that, the 4-year clock occurs. I think we'd have to do some more thinking or research on whether or not we will always be able to gather that information, or what we would be able to ask the applicant to provide to us to demonstrate that. So not ruling it out, just saying there's process that we can't figure out today.
Sure.
to figure out if it's a workable process. So, sorry, thinking out loud. I'm gonna stop thinking out loud. Mike Brandt, you have.
Yeah, I kind of agree with everything being said, active duty and that. I would make a comment that as far as investigative, we have a list of moral questions that help address that, as well as the fact that, if they were under investigation but were found innocent, then that really shouldn't play in to a security hire or not, because, innocent until proven guilty. So as law enforcement, I know there's a lot of times that you can be sued, but that doesn't mean you were guilty. So that shouldn't be able to be held against you.
Just looking back at the questions and lists. Okay, so at least 2 years of experience, not more than 4 years from your date of application for your private security certification. That 4-year time clock starts from your last date of active performing the duties of service. It's kind of where everyone has landed so far. So I'm thinking that would still apply in consideration of a military police as well. We would look at a DD 214 to find out what the dates of service were as military police officer. So that still aligns. So this is eligible to apply. So if it's been within 4 years and you have at least 2 years of the experience, is there a different consideration on the firearms piece? Or is that more of a what's required for training discussion? So a person can still be eligible to start this path.
Eric Knopp, yeah, I would think so. If they've been performing the duties of with a firearm within the last 4 years, I think that would make them eligible. They're still going to have to do this skills test portion and prove that they can shoot straight. And that's
Okay.
part of the training question, I guess.
I think we were talking about for the firearms part for armed, they have to made their qualification within the last year. Otherwise, they have to do the entire armed section again, I think.
Well, so they would have to do the 4-hour refresher, or they'd have to do the 24-hour course.
Sorry, the refresher.
Yeah, I think the general consensus is they're going to have to do at least the refresher. Am I not hearing that correctly?
No, I think you're right, Eric. Mike Brandt. I think I was the one that brought up the 1 year because it's outside of private security's realm of allowability. But I think you're correct when you said that their skill set's going to determine it. And so I think that, yeah, the refresher is fine as long as they do have to perform the qual.
Okay. So I've still got on paper that as long as you've been employed within the path, so as long as it wasn't more than 4 years ago, we're still considering this as eligible prior law enforcement experience to begin the process of taking whatever abbreviated training and skills are decided here in the future. Okay, so lots of head nods and thumbs ups and no dissent. Okay, all right. So we've just knocked out 1, 2, and 3 for right now. 11:28, so we have just about a half of an hour left in our scheduled meeting. Let's start to talk about what would disqualify eligibility to use this prior law enforcement experience. So does their certification need to be in compliance? So I have other associated words that people have heard before, things like suspended, revoked, or under investigation. If their certifications are under investigation by anybody. So it's important to note that private security professional applicants are already required to meet moral fitness standards in order to be eligible. So anyone who is applying for private security has to meet those moral fitness standards. There is not, those standards are not identical to the law enforcement standards. So a law enforcement officer's certification may have been suspended or revoked or investigated. Under those standards, that same conduct may not require action to deny certification in private security. But the question kind of before you is whether or not just the fact that it has been denied, suspended, or revoked in that law enforcement capacity, should that automatically make them not eligible to use their prior law enforcement experience? They would just be able to continue their application if they meet the private security moral fitness standards, but they'd have to complete all of the basic training required. So that's kind of the where the question is coming from, but happy to answer any questions or provide more clarification. As far as hands up, we have Mike Brandt.
I would say absolutely. If you've been suspended, revoked, or you're under investigation, then you would lose that privilege.
Michael?
Michael McNerney, I guess I'm trying to think of a circumstance. I know that, that the requirements are more stringent in law enforcement than they are for private security, but I guess I'm struggling to think of a circumstance where that, circumstance that led to revocation or suspension doesn't compromise the moral standards. So I mean, I guess if there is one that we can think of, I'm certainly open to it, but otherwise I agree with Mike that, if you're not able to hold that certification, you shouldn't be granted privileges to the certification you no longer hold.
Larry Welty, I agree. The DPSST under investigation, they would not be able to apply until the investigation is concluded and they're either cleared or not, so.
Well, and I think they would be eligible to apply, but not apply for the exemption here. Just because that's not what the bill is necessarily stating. They're looking for the exemption or the experience, law enforcement experience. So it'd be just as anybody else would be able to apply. They would be down a different track for applying. But if they, to his point, if they had something there, that they wouldn't be given the privilege of going down a different track.
Would you defer the decision now?
Of the issuance?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think in terms of like the 4-year timeline. If they've got a professional standards case pending for 18 months on their police cert, how does that factor into the 4 years? Is it included? Does it tack on? Does it kind of get?
I think to the point of what he was saying is that they wouldn't be able to apply. They would be able to apply. So they would be down the track that we wouldn't even be looking at the 2 years, the 4 years, just because they have an open case on the CJ side. But they're not privileged to be down this other track.
Okay, so they would be just totally outside of this consideration.
It would be applicable for the exception.
Yeah, okay.
If that's the consensus of the group, but I just wanted to clarify that people can still apply at any time and we'll get them down, whatever they need to be.
That is what I meant.
Stephen?
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. Is it as long as they're in compliance, absolutely they could apply for the exemption. But if there is a case open, then no exemption. They have to go down and apply and go through the full class like everyone else.
Yeah, we need to look at getting rid of the wording DPSST under investigation by DPSST and make it by any agency.
Yes.
Agreed.
Eric?
Can they still be certified? I'm trying to think could they still be certified for private security if their police cert is under investigation? I know the requirements are less stringent, but how close of a line is that?
It really depends on what the conduct is, Eric. So those are, we call like a trigger for our program. And Michelle, you can speak to it more if you'd like, but we will watch those cases, look at the conduct and determine whether or not they would be certifiable in our program. Sometimes we need to wait till they go through the process of the police policy committee or corrections policy committee and on to the board. But it really depends on what the conduct was.
But are there times where, once they've submitted their application and their training, we allow them to work on their under a temporary work permit while we're waiting for that investigation to complete in order to decide whether to deny private security?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Not for the armed certification,
Not
of
for the
course,
armed,
but
for the-
unarmed event alarm. Yes, they can
Okay.
work on a temp during that whole process. but they would have already had to take the training. So if they're under investigation, then they wouldn't be eligible for this. They would go down the full basic course route.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm okay with that. I think if you violate the rules and standards for basic police certification or any type of thing, I agree. If you're not eligible for exemptions if you're not holding the standard.
Mike McNerney, I would say that under investigation doesn't mean you violated the standards, so I think we should be a little more circumspect, but I do think that under the circumstances of somebody being under investigation, not assuming that they were responsible or not responsible, but we have a duty to exercise due diligence and ensure that they have had all the appropriate training. So at that point, we would bump them out of the exemption just for the sake of precaution.
Mike?
I totally agree with Michael. We're not talking, 6 months of a school here. We're talking 14 hours. And so, whether they get the 5-hour refresher or 4-hour refresher, or whether they have to go through 14 hours, it's not such a big deal that we shouldn't steer to the side of caution and take them out of the exemption unless we feel that it's definitely earned.
Go ahead, Larry.
Very well. The one thing I think about is risk management on something like this. So it really depends, and we'd have no way of knowing what the investigation was, because while the investigation's going on, it's not public information. And so, as an example, if I had somebody that was under investigation for, not necessarily by DPSST, but they may be under investigation by their own agency for something that occurred while they were on duty. And it goes down to some of the things I came across with the state police that occurred, that if you allow that person to work on a temporary and they commit the same act while they're working for you, again, your risk management is very, very high on that. So I would really struggle letting somebody go down the path of working on a temporary until the investigation is concluded.
And I appreciate that, but unfortunately, that's not what the bill is, what we're discussing. Like, that would definitely take it would be down a different path of rule changes. Because currently that's just the way that the standard is written. Yeah, do you have any other comment?
And if I could just speak to that, Michelle Morrison, we generally, if we're putting somebody under review, have a good idea of what the investigation is about. And we do have the ability to not issue temporary work permits. So, and it really does kind of fall back on the employer to vet those individuals.
So if you were reviewing someone who wanted to be certified in security, would you know or have an easy way to find out whether because I know we talked about changing this from under DPSST investigation, which you can find that out pretty easily, but to any agency investigating that. If a police agency is investigating them for a crime, if it's an internal.
We generally wouldn't know about internal investigations, but we have access to other agency or other regulatory agencies. I've had nurses, I've had doctors, chiropractors, massage therapists. We're able to get that information and review it.
Yeah. So, but it could be hard to track if we opened the language up to under investigation by any agency to track things like an internal. How would you?
We wouldn't be aware of that unless the individual disclosed that to their employer.
Okay.
And we do ask on our application, but that doesn't mean that those individuals are honest with us about that. And more often than not, they aren't.
So just to summarize, like, unless action is taken internally by the agency, which then results in DPSST suspending or investigating their basic police certification, there's no real enforcement arm here if we make the regulation that way.
Make it broad enough to any investigation.
Correct.
Is that
And I suppose you could make it part of, like, emphasize it on, in the application process for our certifications. That, are you, or have you ever been under investigation by any agency, including,
yeah.
just, and then if they give false information, that in and of itself is kind of an indication that maybe they're not appropriate for an exemption.
Well, and we currently ask that on our application, but by that time, they've already taken the training. So these are going to be people that are going to be wanting to be eligible for this.
Right,
exemption.
I mean the application in the sense that there's gonna have to be some
Yeah,
new application procedure put in place so that people on the front end can know whether they're eligible for the exemption process, so.
yeah.
Exemption.
Yeah, something like that.
Additional comments online, we have Tom.
So yeah, if we keep it at the under investigation part, that just disqualifies them from being able to take the refresher. They would have to do it, basically start from scratch, unarmed or armed or whatever, and then wouldn't DPSST be able to investigate anything that they're under investigation for to deny a license at that point?
Not anything.
Will you repeat your question again?
If we denied basically the refresher part of it, that's what we're talking about. They would have to start completely over or start from scratch as a new applicant. And they would have to meet all the moral standards, and then DPSST could investigate anything that they're under investigation for at that point, correct?
Generally, yes, and that's even how it already applies in the application process for a private security professional. So this discussion so far has lended for generally that if you have been denied, suspended, revoked, or you are under investigation, your certification is under investigation, then you're not eligible to use your prior law enforcement experience to gain private security certification, but you can still continue down the normal path for private security certification. In either case, whether you are a prior law enforcement officer or whether you are a brand new person, you still have the private security professional moral fitness standards in either case. So we're not waiving any of the private security moral fitness certification requirements for prior law enforcement experience. We're just saying whether or not you're eligible to take an abbreviated path versus the standard path.
Well, and I, as a company owner, I'm going to steer towards caution anyway. If I'm in doubt, they're going to take the 24-hour class. If they don't agree with that, they can appeal to DPSST.
And also, Michael McNerney, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was gonna say basically what Mike was saying, which is I think that generally speaking, if the person's certification is not in good standing, then you're gonna want them to take that longer training anyway, just as a risk mitigation, as the executive manager who's gonna be overseeing them. But also it does raise a good point, which is how do we, what's the process look like to validate who is eligible for the abbreviated training so that instructors can know whether or not they can provide that abbreviated training?
And I just want to parse out the any investigation and DPSST investigation. So DPSST investigation, internally, we're going to be able to consult with our other divisions to find out if there's an open professional standards case. And those are usually based on a person's investigation by their employer and the separation because of that investigation, or criminal conduct outside of the employment. So are we looking at any,
Sorry, Mike McNerney. I think even though it may feel overly broad and unenforceable, I do think that we should craft the rule to allow for any known investigation that's underway to preempt the exemption, simply because, again, if the person is being forthright and they let us know, it's cost them, you know, the extra 8 to 10 hours of training time, whatever that falls into. But at least they were forthright about it. If they are deceptive, then that gives us a whole other kettle of fish down the road. But like, you know, the reality is that if we know that there's an open investigation in California because they disclosed it, and we say, sorry, you got to take the full class, we're not really punishing them. We're just saying, hey, you know, unfortunately, this is the line. The line is your certification needs to be in good standing, and you're not there.
Right.
okay. All right, thank you. Did you have anything else?
I did have another comment about, so they have the 2 years of experience and they have left their law enforcement agency and now they've been arrested for a crime. And so we potentially may have some separate application that they submit to find out if they're eligible or not for this exemption. If we open it up to any investigation, it might cover that criminal piece of it as well, that we wouldn't know from the CJ side necessarily because they're no longer employed and in that instance.
Would you normally still run like a leads on them?
We could make that part of
Some
the
circumstances
process.
you can
Yeah.
find it, but
I mean, they eventually have to submit prints,
Yeah.
but I think that might have to be part of that initial eligibility piece.
And that would flush that out and trigger in the fingerprint lens responses. It has, if you know, ever been fingerprinted for employment, which is the majority of law enforcement agencies or any kind of CJIS type clearance. So that would be a trigger for us to check.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going over the PS1 here actually, and with regards to the enforceability, and it, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, it does have a provision here that if they knowingly falsify a document or say that they aren't under investigation and it turns out that they are, that's grounds for revocation or denial of certification or licensure.
That's true. Yes.
Right. Okay, so there
That
seems
would
to be,
That would be an automatic termination in my company.
Yeah, mine too.
okay. So there is a consensus on loss of the privilege to apply using prior law enforcement experience. If you've been denied, suspended, revoked, or are under investigation, potentially under investigation by another agency. When we're thinking about the eligibility, so whether or not a person can or cannot use their experience or what that experience is, are there any other questions or concerns related to the eligibility to participate in this part of the program? All right. We have 10 minutes left in the scheduled meeting. Should we call it and table the rest of the discussion topics, or?
I think we should, because we're pretty hefty.
Okay, so this was a great amount of progress, and we really want to acknowledge and thank you all so much for participating in this. So when we come back on October 29th at 1 o'clock here at DPSST and on Teams. We will have minutes that will be available for the recap so that you have all of that discussion captured for you, as well as we'll be coming back to this memo to pick up on identifying which of the training courses can be substituted with prior law enforcement experience, and hopefully progressing into what will be training and skills requirements be when you're using prior law enforcement experience. Tom, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I got just a quick question on this too. They are going to be required, if they do meet the minimum requirements to take the refresher, they will have to still get fingerprinted or get the background check ran on them, correct?
That is correct. So having the experience doesn't waive the requirements to have the fingerprints, criminal history check, and the background check, and meet all of the other private security standards. It's about what abbreviated training path you can take. Any other last questions or comments or things to add on to the next meeting? Right. Again, thank you all so much. You want to say anything else or?
No, I appreciate the conversation today. This is, and the discussions that we're having and how they are moving quickly. That's great, but I do appreciate the diversity too that we have with our work group. So thank you all for participating, and I look forward to seeing all your faces in a couple weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Larry, did you want to talk more about temporary work permits?